Unblocked Live. We are live on Unblocked Live. And my guest today is Dr. Peter Simi, who I've been talking to for the better part of this last year because we started talking back last summer about extremism. Dr. Simi is an associate professor at Chapman University in sociology. So we have a lot to catch on because this is our first public conversation. I'll hit the intro. This is Unblocked Live. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Unblocked Live. Please subscribe at youtube.com/unblockedlive and feel free to submit questions. Join the chat on YouTube. We're also on Twitter at JLeeQuinn. I'm Jeremy Lee Quinn. This is the Anti-Polarization Podcast, Unblocked Live. And my guest today is Dr. Peter Simi, an expert in extremist movements. For over 20 years, you've studied extremism on the right. Maybe just right off, tell us a little bit about your background. And I know folks are going to have some questions, and we'll put those up and throw those your way. As I said, if you're just joining us, Dr. Simi and I have been talking since last summer, and at the beginning of the civil unrest, I approached him and I had a ton of different questions. We had several conversations. Tell us a little bit about what your focus is in regards to extremism and how you study what you study and what your focus is.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on, Jeremy. I really appreciate it. And I started studying right-wing extremism shortly after the Oklahoma City bombing. So it's been about 25 years, actually. I started back in 1996. I was just starting graduate school at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I initially started out by really just looking at websites. I was just doing, basic, searches on different internet browsers to see what I could find online in terms of these different kinds of extremist websites that were, basically anti-government and white supremacist focused.
What type of group? What type of groups are we talking?
Oh, I mean, we're talking about everything from so-called constitutionalist, militia-type groups to groups like neo-Nazi type groups, Aryan nations, different Ku Klux Klan groups. You had a whole slew of different kinds of folks on the far right who were early adopters of internet technology, and by 1996, when I started searching, were very omnipresent on the web in terms of just literally hundreds, if not thousands of websites that were easily accessible.
And how do you make a determination? I think the bigger question that will come up throughout this conversation is how do you make it? I remember in one of our conversations, I asked you, "Hey, what do you know about shit posting?" and I think I remember you saying, "Well, I don't like it." And the question though is, when are people talking shit? Basically, when are they role playing? When are they avatar? Just being trolls. And how do you quantify what is an actual threat when it comes to ethno-nationalists and their influence in the United States? I became familiar with your work in the consulting that you did for Frontline right after Charlottesville. They did a piece on hate, and then that came down to Orange County, and very memorably, we talked about different strains of white supremacy, I guess you could say, in groups in Orange County. So how do you differentiate the actual expression of these groups in the streets compared to their online presence, which could be anybody saying anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super important question, and certainly there aren't any real easy answers. It depends on what we're looking for. In some respects, if you're just trying to understand the universe of this type of extremism online, then differentiating is less important. If you're trying to make determinations about threat, then obviously these kind of determinations become super important. And if you're looking at the extent to which a particular kind of presence online is one person versus a larger group, and that may represent higher degree of mobilization potential offline, then those kind of determinations are really important. Of course, a lot of this is just a mixed bag. So if we're talking about threat, for example, a single person can pose a substantial threat. So it doesn't need to be a group per se to pose a substantial threat. And I mentioned Oklahoma City bombing. Keep in mind that was planned and executed by, essentially, so at least for those that were arrested, officially, three people. Now, there's speculation there was a larger network involved in the Oklahoma City bombing, but let's just say the official record, it's essentially three people, and really two people primarily, and one person essentially for the most part who ultimately executes the act. So the number of people when you're looking at presence, whether on or offline, can be misleading if you're only equating large numbers to high degree of threat and small numbers to less threat. That can be a real mistake and a real misnomer. Of course, what do we mean by threat? Are we only talking about physical threat? Well, then that's one kind of assessment to make. But if we're talking about threat more broadly, then for instance, things like trolling and shit posting, that actually can pose a real problem that's not insignificant in terms of negative impact on civic culture. And for that matter, even having kind of an intimidating and in some respects, even potentially terrorizing impact on certain individuals or communities who are the target of that trolling or shit posting. So I think we also have to be careful not to underemphasize the potential negative impact that even so-called trolls or shit posters can have. So, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is all of this is very messy, and we need to be careful in terms of how we make these kinds of assessments, and also be clear about what kinds of questions we're actually asking.
Well, the question that I would ask is, and we can go into detail. I mean, you mentioned the Oklahoma City bomber, and that comes up in the press a lot, and it comes up from activist groups a lot, as if the next Oklahoma City bomber is waiting right around the corner. And I don't, and it gets more complicated, obviously, with message boards like 4chan or 8chan, and trying to understand what is a real threat, and then what is influence, and what is mentally ill people latching on to certain ideas, and whether it's true representation of any movement. Now let's dial it back to Charlottesville, because that's a very specific instance in which you were. I became familiar with your work watching the PBS episode of Frontline on hate in Charlottesville, and that is a very specific instance where we saw people with torches marching the night before, and then also the next day during a protest, a mix of counter protest against those who were protesting the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue. So even Charlottesville, I'm understanding, is much more muddied if you don't look at it and just sort of say, I mean, the headline and the obvious outrage is there were white supremacists. There is a video of a Nazi flag in Charlottesville. So straight off the bat, I think most of America was appalled by elements of it. But how do you parse Charlottesville in terms of what the online contingency, the online planning realizing itself on the streets, what that was, and how do you compare it to today?
Well, so Charlottesville, I think it's important to recognize how much planning went into Unite the Right rally and how long that had been happening online, primarily on Discord, but certainly other platforms played a role as well. And let's be clear, the planning of Unite the Right involved lots and lots of discussion about committing acts of violence, using various types of weapons to commit acts of violence, including automobiles, which ultimately did happen when a Dodge Charger, I guess it was driven into a crowd of people that ultimately killed Heather Heyer. So much of the discussions about violence that were had online came to fruition at Charlottesville. And let's also be clear that Unite the Right was organized by neo-Nazis and various assorted white supremacists. And while the statute was the specific reference point for having the rally, it was a much broader motivation in terms of holding that 2-day event, beyond just the statue, but really an effort to try and coordinate across various different organizations and individuals to essentially capitalize on a perceived, if not real, momentum that was building, especially since the election of Donald Trump, and really kind of move this effort forward by using the statute issue, which is a very standard kind of strategy among white supremacists to focus on specific kind of single issues and mobilize around those, knowing that it will help galvanize people and also the idea is to help grow their cause in terms of attract a broader range of adherents potentially.
And bring in a populist crowd, because what I've seen is I've been up close both on watching and observing and documenting protests on the left and the right, that one single event can have multiple flyers. It can bring in people from
Right.
multiple groups across different online platforms and reach out. And that goes for stuff that, many of other types of protests that I've seen. There could be multiple groups, multiple flyers at work. So that struck me this summer as I was documenting and studying that. Looking back at Charlottesville, there are some people who show up there who might have there's a difference between a 4chan activist and a Facebook activist, so to speak. And I don't
Sure.
even like to use the word activist in the terms of extremism, whether it's the right or the left, quite frankly. But because extremist, so if you have an extremist on, or let's just say you have an extremist on 4chan who's organizing, he can be organizing extremists with rhetoric that is much more severe than a Facebook organizer, someone who's on Facebook who's saying, "Hey, this is a rally to protest the statue of Robert E. Lee, or being removed." Then all of a sudden you have, I guess, mainstream normies or showing up at the same protest. Was that the case in Charlottesville during the day? Because at the night it was definitely the tiki torch white nationalist crowd, it seemed. Was there a differentiation in Charlottesville between the night crowd and the day crowd?
I think to some extent that's certainly true. There's a larger, obviously, number of people on Saturday than Friday, and so I think there was a broader kind of base of folks who showed up on Saturday than Friday, with probably much more substantial in terms of Friday folks being in the know. Whereas I think on Saturday you might have had some percentage of folks who showed up that were maybe much more on the periphery, just getting acquainted to the issue, kind of new to the scene, so to speak, or just primarily there based on this issue about the removal of the Lee statue. So yeah, I do think there's it's worth differentiating Saturday from Friday in that respect.
And then how would you compare this this last month? There was a flyer that went out. It was unsourced. I saw some Telegram chatter as well about the flyer, but supposedly there was at least a digital flyer distribution of a White Lives Matter type rally that not only here in Southern California, but across the country, there was speculation or uncertainty as to whether something was going to happen. Now, I went to Huntington Beach. I'm losing track of time. It was a few Sundays ago. I remember that. And I was there and I witnessed everything. But one of my questions going into it, and I even think I labeled my live stream as, quote, White Lives Matter rally, which may or may not happen, because it seemed to me to be very dubious there would be unsourced flyers. As it was leading up to that, you were consulted, much like I consult you and have for the most of this last year, as to what is this? What's the threat level? When you looked at it beforehand and you looked at it afterwards, were there any observations that you made as far as what is, if someone is the ethno-nationalists are out there, what are their current involvement, and how did that play out in terms of this rally that we really didn't see materialize much of across the country a bit ago?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was notable in the days leading up was the number of different Telegram channels that were popping up, and the kind of kind of a unstable aspect to the planning seemed pretty fraught with some internal dissension and some just lack of coordination and some various issues that seem to be hampering greater degree of organization. So
Was there,
that
sorry, was there ever a group that was responsible for this that you know of, or was this all anonymous?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard speculation about some different potential sources, but as far as I'm aware, it's all under the banner of White Lives Matter, with a variety of different folks that seem to have been involved. I do think that's worth noting as well. The whole notion of using kind of phraseology like "White Lives Matter" that I think for someone who studies this is pretty clear, but for somebody who's maybe less aware might not fully appreciate what that's all about. Of course, the whole phrase itself and how it develops in response to Black Lives Matter, is pretty indicative of the sentiment behind it. But nonetheless, it's not as overt as, say, National Socialist Movement or Aryan Nations. These kind of terms that are going to immediately evoke associations with Nazism and so forth. And that's again another long-term strategy that has been utilized by white supremacists and others on the far right to use more innocuous sounding terms that aren't really clearly associated with specific ideas or beliefs or feelings that would raise a lot of concern among folks in the general public more broadly, in order to kind of create an opening of sorts, right? The idea is that you use a little bit less clear language as a way to create confusion and to open up potential conversations.
And the flyer was really clear, actually, because when you read it on paper, it was one thing, but when you saw the digital flyer, there was sort of this retro Art Deco type Aryan statue that was very, early 20th century looking, and it the graphic design told you what, if you had any other questions, those were answered, I think, by the graphic design in the promotion of that. Now, of course, from New York to uh, there was very little turnout for this, phantom protest. Can I ask a question? This question, because I was wondering as I was going, and I was right there when the guy with the swastika tattoo was across the street from the Huntington Beach pier, and the crowd kind of moved on him and confronted him, and I was right there asking, "What's the story behind the Nazi tattoo?" I asked it several times in the video, and as I was asking it, I was wondering, how much am I creating this? I mean, that this guy has a swastika tattoo. I would like to know what the story is. It a prison tattoo? Is it a thing? Does he have any wider? He had three people that were with him that said, "Hey, let's go, let's get out of here." So he had friends. So he wasn't
Mhm.
friendless. But is he part of a bigger group? There were so many questions that I had when you see this one person. Now there was also who has been identified as a former Klan leader of sorts that was there sort of innocuously. He had a cane. It almost looks like something you'd see out of a movie, but he was just sort of, he had a cane and he was there in looking like just, an older person on the pier. Hagen, I think was his last name. And gosh, it does sound like it's out of a movie. And then you had another guy who also looked like he was out of a movie. He had kind of a mummified type burlap sack type mask like you'd see out of the HBO rendition of The Watchmen, when all, the white supremacists, and who does that is there is a group called Patriot Front, which showed up in late January after the Capitol, got very little media attention, but they're the ethno-nationalist Patriot Front that shows up, and they kind of have this mummified look as well. Then there was a fourth guy who had some sort of runic extremist stuff tattooed on the back of his bald head. So there were at least four, supremacist leaning types. And the thing with the mummified guy, he was saying hail stuff like, hey, he said hail Jesus at one point. So there's those cases I saw as pretty solidly in the ethno-nationalist category. Then you had other people who were just Marines. One guy had a skull tattoo and he was like, yeah, I got it in the Marines. That's just, it's not a Nazi thing, And they were like, but isn't that the dead head, the Totenkopf dead head, And he was like, no, I'm a Marine. And then there was another Marine who was,
And what is that? So he's a Marine. So what?
right.
So
So we
I
said, are you here for White Lives Matter is what we said. Is this part of, and he vehemently denies. He says, no, I'm just here, on the pier and I'm
oh, he was just there, just happened to
yeah,
be
yeah. He's like, I'm
coincidentally
not.
there.
He's like, I'm
Oh, I
not here
got you.
for any White Lives Matter. I'm just a guy on the
Oh, I
pier.
got you.
So
Okay,
the
I see.
mob saw his tattoo and they went after him. Well,
Oh no. Okay.
the mob also went after just regular ass bikers, like dudes who had Harley Davidson 1% type, leather jackets. And then the crowd thought that they were 3%ers. Like they weren't making the distinction between just uh, I don't know, bikers, just bikers, and even middle-aged white dudes in flip-flops. The mob went after. So when it comes to really making a distinction, I mean, that a mob isn't really going through due process and saying and talking to people and saying, hey, what are you about? Even when they get frustrated, they go for the target. There was one guy that was a QAnon type. He was the one with the giant flagpole who eventually got attacked. He was really out there. I mean, he was going on about the baby's adrenochrome stuff, and he thought that the Democrats killed Kobe Bryant. So, I mean, it's like, and then you had one guy who was a former Marine who wanted to debate students, and he actually was like, I'm a Trump supporter and I'm here to debate you. And there was actually some interesting dialogue. He didn't get attacked. But I guess what I'm saying is, I was asking myself as I was following the guy with the swastika tattoo, how much am I creating this situation or adding fuel to the fire by yelling out over and over again? What's the story behind? Because then people heard me and then they started following in. And I was asking myself that question. Do you ever ask yourself, especially leading up to an event like this, hey, I just talked to the LA Times. It's a big, huge, organization. Have I made this threat sound more amplified than it maybe is?
Well, I mean, that's certainly always a point of consideration. But I mean, Jeremy, from my perspective, in doing this for 25 years, it's the opposite, right? I mean, we don't take this threat nearly serious enough. I mean, you mentioned a while back towards the beginning something about, the next Tim McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. I mean, we've had plenty of Tim McVeighs. Maybe they didn't have quite as high a body count, thankfully, fortunately. But there's been plenty of Tim McVeigh since Tim McVeigh. I mean, we
Just this month,
yeah,
it feels like.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, I don't think we've taken this threat nearly serious enough, and I do think there's a difference between serious, kind of sober analysis and sensationalism and hype. And obviously, I do think we should be very careful and cautious and not sensationalize and hype things. But I think our penchant has been towards ignoring and minimizing the extent of this problem. We have, obviously, our country is founded in many respects on white supremacist violence. And that's part of our history and has been consistent throughout our country's history. And so it's something we have had a very difficult time reckoning with. And that continues to be, I think, a major problem for us to really acknowledge how much our own society produces this type of extremism and violence. So
But I
I kind
guess,
of, yeah.
so do you look at it holistically then? And that's been my big question for organizations like the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Center. At the same time I contacted you, I contacted them and had conversations with them back in June and July because I thought there were white supremacists that had started the Minneapolis riots. And that's because the people who started the agitation the night that the Minneapolis police precinct burned, when I reviewed the video and I sourced all this different video, they were not black people. And the Black Lives Matter group that was there the night that the Minneapolis police precinct burned, you can see in the video a guy with a Bermuda hat is saying, "This is not what it is. This is not what it is." There were many in the community who were trying to keep peaceful protest. Now, there were the first people who stormed the gates of Minneapolis were white. And so I, in my mind, said white supremacists. What I didn't know at the time was that in Minneapolis, there's a heavy anarchist culture. Now, I even tried to fit, we can go into the Umbrella Man. We had many exchanges about this one guy, and I realized this one guy who was a biker, by the way, and was part of a Aryan biking gang, who had those expressions in that history, but he was a suspect. He was never charged. Police never went forward with anything with him. So we don't know. It's not confirmed that that suspect was definitively the Umbrella Man. I even tried to call the guy on the phone and say, "Hey, are you," but he didn't text back. I'll just say that much. But so a lot of this gets really murky, and I'm trying to figure out, and I was coming to you at the time, and I was seeing things that I wanted to see. I had to confront my own biases because even with the Proud Boys and stuff, I was trying to fit them in an ethno-nationalist, and I went to Tulsa and I tailed them. And I realized that there were only a handful of them, and that if they had been more involved in starting riots, they would have shown up certainly with more of a presence in Tulsa during the president's first speech. What I saw instead were a handful of locals who ended up lighting up and smoking weed with some of the Black Lives Matter people and listening to Bob Marley. When a guy, sometimes it takes one person with the right vibe, and he had this big Rasta tam, and he had a boombox, and he was playing "Is This Love," and everybody decided, you know what, forget it, and then everybody got pepperballed by the police as Trump was leaving. So the whole thing was a surreal story to me in and of itself, as far as my on the ground experience. But it made me question: am I looking or over giving too much? Has anything, let's frame it this way. Has anything changed since Charlottesville? If you're someone who looks at the Capitol, who looks at the Proud Boys and says, this is all white supremacy, it's all the same, out of the same cookie cutter, is that inaccurate in your view? From your perspective, how have things differed from Charlottesville as far as what you saw playing out on the streets this last year?
Well, what I've always said is that white supremacy is not a cookie cutter, right? White supremacy is way more diverse and divergent and complex and has all kinds of nuances to it and contradictions, frankly. There's all kinds of internal contradictions, things that don't really fit together very well that fall under the broader banner of white supremacy. So, I mean, I think that's part of the problem is that we think of it as a cookie cutter. We think of it, white supremacy equals neo-Nazis, it equals a Klan hood, it equals a shaved head and a swastika tattoo. Those are all obvious indicators, but that's, certainly doesn't encompass the entirety of white supremacy. And it gets a lot more murky when you really start looking at it, I think, more closely. So part of the problem is that the cookie cutter create such a narrow definition for white supremacy that when you don't see the stuff that fits easily in the cookie cutter, then you say, oh, well, it's not white supremacy, right? So to me, that's a real big problem that we have. And so when we look at January 6th, is it the same as Charlottesville? Well, no, they're two separate incidents. Is there meaningful associations and connections? Absolutely. Is it part of a broader kind of zeitgeist, right? Is it part of a broader gestalt of a backlash that has been brewing, an animus, anxiety, frustration, and anger that has been brewing? Absolutely. And so when Merrick Garland, during his confirmation hearing, says that you can draw a straight line from the Reconstruction era founding of the Ku Klux Klan, which was not one thing, it was a lot of things, right? We talk about the Klan, it should be clans, because there were paramilitary organizations of various names that formed during the Reconstruction era and fought a second civil war that we don't teach in our U.S. history classes, certainly not in K through 12, fought a second civil war and successfully, to a large extent, won that second civil war. You can draw a straight line from the Reconstruction era founding of the Klan and other paramilitary organizations to the 95 Oklahoma City bombing to the January 6th insurrection. And I think Garland's absolutely right.
Okay,
And
wait,
so,
sorry, you lost me between, that's a big leap between Oklahoma City to the insurrection. So what is the
well, that's the problem, seeing it as a big leap when it is part of a backlash that's very much been a central thread that runs consistently, not episodically, but consistently through our country's history. As social progress builds in certain directions, largely through the efforts of social movements like Black Lives Matter and during earlier periods, the Civil Rights Movement and many other movements, you always see a backlash. And that's what we're seeing with January 6th is a manifestation in a very significant way because we're talking about insurrection. We're talking about a riot on our nation's capital. That's what we're seeing is the manifestation of this most recent backlash.
and and what's the sort of smoking gun or the proof that links that all together? Because I saw a lot of things, and I've been watching both sides, from a street view all year, and that's the conclusion that the Southern Poverty Law Center made. And I asked them. I showed up at their press conference on, I think it was March or February the 1st, and they announced that the Capitol riot was an expression to maintain white supremacy. That was the Southern Poverty Law Center's conclusion. I asked them to support that with evidence. And it's months later, and they've never been able to answer that question to me, which is, what is your evidence that this is that anxiety that you speak of, that it's not other things? For example, COVID restriction, overreach of government, that it's not a reaction to Antifa itself, which right-wing media portrays Antifa as much more, I would say, certainly competent than they are. I mean, they showed up. They put the latest headline with Antifa up north was they put the bloody pig's head on the wrong doorstep of one of the expert witnesses in the Chauvin trial up in Santa Rosa. Dropped the bloody pig head, splattered the door with blood. Guess what? It was his former house. He doesn't live there. So certainly, I think right-wing media creates a lot of anxiety itself. Fox News and the whole toxicity of what that has been since the 2000s, I think creates that anxiety, certainly, that the Antifa, the groups, the people, and dressed head to toe in black who are burning and tearing things down, that is more of a threat than perhaps, and as I said, certainly more competent than I've witnessed.
Yeah.
So how do we know it's not a reaction more immediate, more contemporary, that it's not connected all the way back to police and slave catchers and all these other activist talking points that I hear, but that it's a very, I tend to think of the American people as having a very short-term memory and flighting through trend to trend and not as focused as maybe we imagine. I guess what I'm looking for is what's the concrete evidence that
I'm happy to
connects all
provide
this?
some. Yeah.
Okay,
So
fantastic.
let me first say that the things you describe are not unassociated or disconnected from white supremacy. So it's not an either or, it's a constellation. When you're talking about backlashes don't usually emanate from one single thing. It's usually a constellation of factors that lead to a backlash. Um, and as far as the lack of historical thread from slave patrols to contemporary police violence, I don't think anyone's saying that it is literally the same thing. What they're saying is that we're talking about a string over time of factors that are connected to each other and aren't disconnected. And so when you look at the 9 minutes of Derek Chauvin murdering George Floyd, to not see the hundreds of years of history of racist violence in his eyes, I think it does a disservice to understanding how that incident unfolded and why George Floyd was perceived as such a threat in that situation, and why Derek Chauvin ultimately did what he did in such a callous manner. So when we talk about January 6th, what's the evidence? The evidence is we're talking about a number of organizations that had oversized impact in terms of what happened January 6th. But we're also talking about a kind of a thematic um, motivation for why January 6th unfolded the way it did. And the notion of a stolen election, for example, to not see the racist underpinnings of that seems to really discount the way in which a race has consistently played a role in American politics. And so, I mean, it is one heck of a coincidence to say that the concerns about the election being stolen and the focus on uh, certain urban areas where the black vote in particular was being targeted as being fraudulent because it was part of, certainly one of the factors that ultimately produced the results that we saw in the 2020 election. I mean, to disassociate that from race, is in the same way we would see with the voter suppression efforts that we're currently seeing. That, well, it's only about the interest in voter integrity, and it has nothing to do with past voter suppression efforts, where a whole host of different strategies were used to prevent blacks from voting. I mean, these are pretty disingenuous talking points, it seems to me, to frame it in that way. So I think January 6th, in terms of what's the straight line, it's not a single issue, but it's a series of issues that do connect to things like the Oklahoma City bombing in the past and the founding of the Ku Klux Klan during the Reconstruction era. And again, the evidence, I would say, is organizationally in terms of the role that certain organizations played, but then in terms of the motivations, the things that drew people there, and what those motivations kind of reflect or represent. I think it's very hard to disconnect those from a broader backlash that we're seeing in this country.
I think so. This is interesting because, going to the election, obviously, what happened, in my opinion, was extremely cynical. I mean, it was the night, the night of is when the gears were shifting and turning for this stolen election narrative, and I found it incredibly cynical by the former president of the United States. Now, I approach it, and it might be just a difference in the way you different people approach a problem, because the question to me isn't that disassociation isn't disingenuous but I need proof to associate it. In other words, I'm always looking for the thing that says, yes, this was racially motivated. And I'm looking for that. So it may be just a way that
What was the proof that literacy tests were racially motivated?
What were the proof that you're going back to what year now? You're the more the historian than I am. So how far are we going back? Help me out.
Yeah, so literacy tests during the 1950s, for example.
Right. And what movie was that I saw it characterized in it as well? I mean, yeah, no, are we in the same
What I'm saying, but the point
era?
being is that at every point in time, there's an explanation for why racism's not racism.
But if that's the case, then there will always be. Will we ever notice the progress that we make? Will we ever be aware of? I guess I'm. It's a different look. I'm willing to consider. Certainly
Well, let's go to this one. What
yeah.
about and I know you were there January 6th, and so maybe you were at a part of the crowd where this wasn't being said, but you've got multiple black officers and folks, working for the government that have testified, right, at least not in court, but provided testimonials firsthand about use of the N word. But that wasn't those aren't clear indications of racism, because sometimes people just get angry and they say use racial
Well,
slurs.
no, I think that's a clear indication of racism. Sure, I will concede that absolutely.
Okay, all right.
But obviously, all right. Here's the other thing about the Capitol: you had a group of tens of thousands of people, and again, when the Southern Poverty Law Center comes to the conclusion that this was to maintain white supremacy, then I would need proof, or I'm asking for proof, to show me that that we're not talking about outline. We're not just talking about the jerk in the hoodie, the anti-Semitic hoodie, or the guy. And I realized this. This is my own
Did
experience with
anybody
T-shirt.
ask the guy with the Camp Auschwitz T-shirt to leave? That you're not welcome here with that kind of attire? We
Well,
won't allow that.
well, here's the thing. Uh, so John Sullivan was right next to him. He appears in John Sullivan's video. Sullivan is from, for those of you who don't know, I've interviewed him before. He was uh, he was he was participating too, because he's the one who's saying burn it down at times, but it's controversial, his work in that regards. He allowed himself to be a little bit more, no, I would say much more of a participant than I ever do, because I don't interact. I maintain the fly on the wall uh, journalist stance when I'm in the middle of a crowd. But anyways, he appears in that video, and this is the thing. There's so much going on. People aren't checking out each other's shirts, and then there's another just weird sardonic thing about that awful sweatshirt. It says Camp Auschwitz, and on the back it says staff, which is just it's so typical of these just kind of over the line custom shirts that we've seen, from Pinochet was correct, or to all of
Yeah,
these
free helicopter rides.
free helicopter rides, yeah, that kind of stuff. This is definitely something that I saw, which were the custom made right wing shirts that were kind of coded in. And in his case, it's not that coded, though. It's not clear
No.
anybody, and it's not clear anybody notices. And here's the other thing: Sullivan is himself.
Did you notice?
I didn't notice anything like that. I was looking too. I was looking for two things. I was looking for symbology, tattoos, three things, and firearms. And I could not find any of the three among the tens of thousands. But again, you're looking for a needle in a haystack. It's like going to Coachella and looking specifically for somebody who has one band,
Sure.
represented on their T-shirt. It's not an
And
easy thing to do.
that's why, if your cookie cutter is only Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts, attire of that overt and clear cut messaging, then your cookie cutter is way too narrow and way too small, right? Because what we've known for a long time is people of this mindset understand that those kind of overt messages are not effective ways of presenting oneself. And so there's been a real emphasis on not wearing those kinds of shirts or sweatshirts or clothing and so forth. And even frankly, not getting, tattooed in ways that are super obvious. So that has to be taken into consideration as well, which is the emphasis on toning things down and trying to blend in more.
Right. And here's a question. One of my first, before a different Antifa people decided not to talk to me anymore, because the New York Times article came out, and it sort of, there was an effort to just not talk to me. But I was talking to an Antifa, I guess, a very present Antifa activist out of the East Coast named Darrell Lamont Jenkins, and who was featured in Alt-Right Age of Rage, that Netflix film.
Mm-hmm.
And I had many conversations with him before he realized he couldn't talk to me anymore. But one of the questions that I had for him, well, if you tone it down, if these people are taking away the rituals, if they're taking away the symbology, if they're taking away all these things, well, then how are they white supremacists anymore? Because if they're stripping everything down, how do you know what the quotient is, the real sort of organized white supremacy quotient. Let me ask this. Is it different now than it was at Charlottesville? Is it less? Has the right itself moderated and not just toned it down, but actually stripped these things away at all since 2017, in your
Yeah,
opinion?
well, yeah, I mean, that was part of the rub with, and even some people who weren't super excited about the idea of organizing a Unite the Right. There was some concerns that you're moving us in the opposite direction that we've been going, which is this kind of more cultural approach, right? Getting into kind of certain social networks and influencing things through culture, through online spaces, gaming platforms, so forth and so on. And you even had folks after Unite the Right that very clearly say, look, okay, we did this big event. It was okay. There's going to be some repercussions. That's not a good thing, but it doesn't really matter anyways. We need to go back to doing what we were doing before and focus on essentially this kind of cultural work, which is shifting the narrative, moving things more in their direction in a more gradual way, with the idea that probably at some point there's going to be a break, and then at that point we're then we've got the race war to fight. But until then, it's a little bit different kind of strategy. So yeah, that's definitely part of it. I mean, yeah, and let's go even broader than that. Would you say Derek Chauvin's a white supremacist?
So this, I did not follow the trial. Um, and I was following other stuff this last, couple of weeks, but I did not. But I will say this: anyone making that determination, I would hope, would be looking at concrete evidence to make that determination.
Here's
And
what I would say: it
yeah,
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You have a system of white supremacy that treats individuals like George Floyd as automatically and inherently dangerous threats that need to be put down. And when you have that system organized around that principle of white supremacy that sees blackness through the lens of criminality, violence, and is inherently fearful of the threat that poses, without any overt acts to support any kind of determination of threat. It doesn't matter. All you need to do is see George Floyd, and the officers perceived him without any basis of being a lethal threat. So his mere existence they perceived as a lethal threat. And that's because we have a system of white supremacy that organizes things in that way, that organizes our perceptions in that kind of way. And so is Derek Chauvin a white supremacist individually? I don't know anything about him other than what he did during those 9 minutes. And that was an act of white supremacy. And that is very clear from the 9-minute footage.
how, in your estimation, this system, are you talking about the entire United States? Does Canada count? How do we do, how are
No,
you delineating? So Canada
yeah,
does not count.
no, I mean, I'm talking about the United States. I'm not talking about North
Well,
America,
I'm
broadly
just trying to
speaking.
figure, I'm
Obviously,
just,
white supremacy is a global system, though. Certainly, it exists in other countries, including Canada. But I mean, my comments are meant to be limited to the United States. But if we want to talk about white supremacy as a global problem, which we should, we can certainly do that.
so does that mean that if you're a white cop, you're partaking in a white supremacist system, therefore you're capable of committing a white supremacist act that you don't realize is white supremacist? Does that also mean that if you're a black participating in a white supremacist system, that you're also capable of committing a white supremacist act as a black person?
Look, two of the four officers that day that were part of Floyd's murder were not white.
Right.
I mean, look at how
I
many of the officers that participated in the beating of Rodney King. They weren't exclusively white. Time and time again, we see this. So the system, we're not talking about individuals. We're talking about an organization of a system. We're talking about a culture that has traditions, that has beliefs and feelings, because emotions are absolutely critical here. We can't understand any of this if we don't pay attention to emotion and the role that emotions have in shaping our behavior. So all of these things go beyond individuals, right? We can't get stuck in looking at this just at the individual level. We have to take a broader lens to look at how this operates and functions.
So here's an interesting perspective on this. I see what you're saying, and I understand from an academic point of view the points you're trying to make. Do we expect everybody to agree to this? That this is? Do you consider it a theory, or do you consider it fact that this is a white supremacist system? Is that theory or fact? If it is theory, is it incumbent that everybody buys into it? I don't want to say buys in. That sounds a little dismissive, but let's say subscribes to it. If it is just theory, and if people do not subscribe to it, they say, "Well, I don't believe that. That's just simply what I don't believe." Then, how much tolerance do we as a society have to people who disagree and don't believe that this is a system of white supremacy?
What's not a theory is the existence of systemic racism. We can see the factual basis very clearly. If we just look at the criminal justice system, we can see that play out in so many different ways. I mean, you can fill a library with all the studies and books that have been written about the way in which the criminal justice system exemplifies or exhibits systemic racism. So, I mean, to disregard systemic racism as it relates to the criminal justice system, it is really disregarding a large volume of facts, a large volume of evidence. Do you have the right to do that as a citizen in the United States? Absolutely. You have the right to disregard all kinds of things. And you have the right to disregard just about any facts that you like, and say that the evidence that you feel in, no confidence in that evidence, and so it's not meaningful to you. I'm not suggesting that those you should be prevented from doing that, but whether we tolerate that, in terms of what do we mean by tolerate? I mean, that's a different question, because I think we have to be careful about saying all opinions are equal, because I think we have that tendency to say, well, everyone's entitled to their opinion and they're all essentially equal. I mean, this becomes part of a kind of anti-intellectualism, anti-science approach that we have a long history of in this country, and this exists, beyond just in terms of racism and issues related to race more broadly. We do have this anti-science and anti-intellectualism that creates a lot of problems for our society. And again, should people be prevented from being anti-science? Absolutely not. But that's not something we should take lightly either.
I guess when it comes to assessing the contemporary environment, if you had a colleague who was also a professor who said, had a very differing opinion, and said, I think that we've made a lot of progress since, the 90s, and, Rodney King, and you mentioned, we were talking about the Oklahoma City bomber, and that a lot of this stuff that is happening online is a issue of it's a much bigger, it's the social dilemma. It's the that anger is trending, and that it doesn't affect just the right, but it also affects the left. Would that, all opinions are not equal, would that silence effectively somebody who had that opinion? And there was a question that I saw earlier that I wanted to bring up, which is precisely this. In Dr. Simi's view, is there anyone who is credible investigating the extreme left-wing groups?
Oh, I mean, there are a lot of folks that focus on the left. I mean, I happen to focus on the, purposefully, intentionally. I don't say it happened by accident. I chose to focus on the far right, in part because I felt like it was to a large extent ignored. And I do think that that's borne out by facts and evidence. But yeah, certainly there's actually quite a bit of study of the far left. I've done a little bit of work on that. I've interviewed former left wing extremists, but certainly haven't devoted or dedicated the amount of time that I have to the far right. But yeah, there's absolutely a body of research, both historical in terms of looking at, for instance, the 60s and 70s, the Weather Underground and other folks that would kind of fall under this categorization of left wing extremism, as well as more recent studies looking at more contemporary, going back to some of the groups or networks like Animal Liberation Front and Environmental Liberation Front that we saw more in the 90s and in mid 2000s, or even more contemporary Antifa, Antifa, and kind of more recent folks on the left. So yeah, this is not something that's, I think, what I see a lot is if I talk about far right extremism, the immediate response is, why aren't you talking about the far left? Well, because the conversation, that's not what I do, but there are other people who do that. And so I think, if you were to look at, for instance, extremism studies, terrorism studies, I mean, it's very disproportionately focused on Islamic extremism in particular. I mean, that's certainly the bulk of the attention, especially since 9/11.
Are we talking about
So,
in academia, or are we talking about in the government? What are we talking
yeah,
about
I'd
here?
say both. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to look at, I think DHS and the FBI, many within DHS and the FBI would accept my assessment here that they have been disproportionately focused on Islamic extremism since 9/11 to a very large extent, and only recently really have you seen a much greater effort to try and rectify that imbalance.
I see. So is there any, I mean, we talked about, or Antifa has been mentioned also in some of the comments here, and they have, I get the sense that by some of the comments, and I won't go into all of them, that people feel that Antifa has been given a pass to some extent. That we're not looking, and this is something that I noticed, that we're not necessarily in the press looking at extremism and hate holistically, in the sense that, I just always go back to Romeo and Juliet and reading it in high school, and as someone who's, always loved acting and theater, that it's been more than just something that I read in a book. It's been a part of my life philosophy and pacifism, which is that violence breeds violence, hate breeds hate. When I see, and I've been in the streets and I've heard, death to everything from death to cops to death to, a certain journalist up in the Pacific Northwest who shall not be named. But I guess what I'm saying is that I sense I empathize with the frustration that some have, that we've put all this attention to one side, and we're not necessarily looking at things holistically. And if we have a conversation again soon, I am willing to listen and hear more as far as the concrete connections, because they're still murky to me, to be quite honest. As far as, and this goes back for me to Tulsa. When I was first at Tulsa, that would have been, I remember it was right after Juneteenth, because the initial controversy and surprise was, why is Trump scheduling a rally in Tulsa on Juneteenth? And it could have been coincidence. I don't know, but it certainly got the imagination going. When I arrived in Tulsa, I expected to see full-on white supremacists. I stayed overnight in the line. I certainly saw a few Q shirts, and the Q guy that was right next to me he seemed like a nice guy. I didn't want to talk about, Q, and I know a lot more than I did back in June. I'll say that much, and I saw a lot of people. It was almost like the people who were following Trump were groupies. They were fans. This one woman showed me pictures she's like, this is when we saw him in Dallas. This is when we saw. So it was literally like being at a rock concert with people who were following. Now, I looked at every T-shirt. I looked at every tattoo, and I only found one guy. in the whole, line of the thousands of people. There weren't actually that many thousands. That was the big story. It was that Tulsa rally was a bust. It was right. It was a little. It was early in the pandemic, it being last June, and I found one guy with what was probably an 88 prison tattoo of some sort, which of course stands for HH, and we all know what that means. And then he covered it up later, and I thought, coming away from Tulsa and what I described as tailing the Proud Boys, talking to the Boogaloo guys, the first Boogaloo I met was black, and he was telling me he just was going on about the Second Amendment, and the Boogaloo's really more anarchist than anything, so I was very confused coming out of Tulsa, because what I expected I did not find, and I knew I could not just take this one guy's tattoo and say, well, I was just at a white supremacist rally because I saw one guy who had a 88 tattoo. So whereas I'm still searching for that evidence to
Yeah.
to say that the system, and again, is this a theory? Is systematic supremacy, is that a theory, or is that something
Well, no,
that's
it's not.
being taught?
Well, for instance, we're going to talk about Trump. Let's talk about Trump. What do we know about Trump support? We know that racial resentment is one of the strongest predictors for voting for Trump. That's evidence. That's fact. That's not really debatable. There's been, enough studies there to really be able to suss that out. That is a very strong predictor for people who like Trump. Is it exclusive to, Trump only attracts the support of whites? A, no, clearly not the case. And B, you can have racial resentment without being, that's not exclusive to whites either. So, and then, the Tulsa rally, it's a tricky one, right? I wouldn't want you to report that you attended a white supremacist rally. But on the other hand, I wouldn't want you to report that you didn't because just met the one guy with the 88 tattoo. Because again, if that's the cookie cutter, that's just such a narrow cookie cutter, that if unless you've got an 88 tattoo, you're not in this designation, or unless you're wearing the Camp Auschwitz clothing, you're not in this designation. I mean, that's just so narrow. It's not really
Well,
accurate, I don't think.
look, I've talked to Proud Boys, and I've had one of them tell me there were white supremacists in this group. The question to me was always, well, if you had moderates that were someone like Enrique Tarrio, who I think we would say is a moderate on that white supremacy spectrum that you see, that you're talking about, what's the end sort of goal? You can't, if, do you think that if you disband these groups, or you deplatform them and they're sent to the corners of the internet in encrypted chat rooms, are we more safer when Parler is taken down and everything, that talk and that anxiety that you're talking about is not out in the open anymore, but is sort of kicked to the corner? Does that mean it's gone, or certainly does that mean that it may be brewing into something that is even exacerbates the situation? That's been my question.
Yeah.
If you had a moderate like Tario, say comparatively to ethno-nationalists, for example, and you had a few ethno-nationalists, were we afraid that the ethno-nationalists were going to, because certainly after the Capitol, it was like, a couple of Proud Boys divisions did separate and said, we found out Tario worked with the FBI, and so we're out, or whatever. The question in my mind was always, were those people going to have more of an effect on the entire group, or being, the hardliners or the moderates? And my sort of desire has always been for moderation, whether people are from the right or the left, that we work on real solutions. That I see many of our problems being economic, and that a push for economic justice, I think, will have more people meeting in the middle than we realize, because we're distracted by pointing the finger at a very small amount of extremists on either side. That's how I have experienced it over the last year. And so I wonder if the conversations that we have somehow erode our path to progress.
Well, I
If
mean,
if
yeah, I
we're
mean, there's,
obsessed, if we're obsessed in the media, for
yeah,
example,
I'm not sure we're talking about a small number though. I mean, with QAnon, we're talking about millions and millions.
with
With
QAnon.
Yeah, with QAnon, I mean, I consider QAnon to be extremist. I assume you do as well.
I don't
the,
consider it to be normal now. So it's it's out there, but the QAnon thing is so yeah. No, it's that's another one that I'm trying to get through that series on it and stuff. And every time I fall asleep to it often, to be quite honest, because I just like this is so stupid in my mind, and I just can't.
but
But I
millions can.
but millions can't, sure,
Yeah.
but I guess the threat of ethno nationalism, the thing I think Charlottesville, there are two incidents that imprinted themselves when I was looking for white supremacists, literally everywhere throughout June. There were two incidents that probably imprinted themselves on my psyche, and of course that would have been Charlottesville, because I think the image of the people with the torches chanting what they were chanting of the next day of a Nazi flag and people with their shields, white supremacist symbology. I think that's what I would. Oh, well, there's that, and then I also want to talk about Dylan Roof. I mean that has stuck in my head too. So the idea is that the next Charlottesville or the next Dylan Roof could be right around the corner, but could it? And how
Well,
close are?
yeah, Dylan
What's the
Roof. I mean, we saw Dylan Roof in El Paso. We saw Dylan Roof in Pittsburgh. We saw Dylan Roof just in my backyard in San Diego. I don't know how many Dylan Roofs we've seen since Dylan Roof. It's hard to keep up with.
and even the shooter in Indianapolis, that they're learning new information about the FedEx shooting and some of the sites that he went to a year ago. There was also an incident where he had a gun previously, and law enforcement was engaged, and the mother saw it, and so these are ongoing, and it's not to say that these, again, when I bring up holistically, we also had incidents such as, Boulder, Colorado, and that don't fall into that, right? And
Yeah, no, not
pe-
all violence is far
right,
right violence. I mean, that's for sure. But
and
going back to the Antifa, because you mentioned you had a number of questions about that. I mean, how many people can we attribute in terms of fatalities that can be attributed to Antifa? But how many? What are we up
so
to now?
well, we do know. Uh, so this is, I know what this is what was brought up to me in that Southern Poverty Law Center live press conference, where essentially my question was, what attention are you giving to Antifa and stuff? And Michael Hayden came on and said it was offensive that I asked the question. And then he brought up all these other incidents, and he says, well, this is the body count versus, Michael Reinl, which he didn't even mention. But yes, Michael
Okay, so
Reinl
that's
was
one. We've
right.
got one because I was going to say Portland, definitely. Okay, although okay, so there's one. Any
So
others?
so um that's obviously the big one. Somebody was just brought up Chaz, they said in the comments, and I don't
Okay,
have this
but
verified,
wasn't
but
that internal? In other words, wasn't the it
I
was Antifa killing Antifa and Chaz, or was that?
well, I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
know. I don't
yeah.
want to speculate, but I know what you're saying. But the thing is, I guess that I see where you're getting, and I want to see if I can make this connection on my own here, which is, you're saying that there's a culture, or a whether it's a culture of violence, but again, the common thread that I see in all these shootings and all these incidents, and even go to the guy who I stabbed and drove into the Capitol, to Indianapolis, to we're getting down to Atlanta, Georgia, outside of Atlanta, with the spas. I see the commonality I see from all of them are young men. It's
That is
not.
for sure.
I don't know that I zero in on white supremacy, like everybody else does. But I look back on my 20s, and the anxiety and the loneliness and the inadequacy that you feel as a young man, especially if you don't have friends, if you don't have connections, if you don't feel that you're worth anything, that you can't attract any sort of mate, that you're I don't know, I mean, we didn't have in my day. I would say online, you're alone online. I mean, we didn't, when I was in my 20s, you just kind of you suffered it out. But
Right. You were alone, alone.
you were alone, and you dealt with it, and so the commonality in my mind, and maybe that's my it's just the way that I see all this is that, I was a staunch gun control person for a very long time. That's changed because I saw society break down, and I saw people's businesses being burned, and I saw both the press and the police being out of commission, so to speak. Um, and Because of that, my views on guns have changed. Also, I've been around them so much this last year. Also, going to red states, I've been right next to them. I've worn plates, and culturally, as a Californian, whose parents met at UC Berkeley in the '60s, like that was something that was very different. I've fired a gun once in my life, and it was because for an acting part I had to go learn. So culturally, I'm very and still identify as a pacifist. I'm very far away from the culture of guns. That said, I understand the right to bear arms a lot more than I did a year ago. I will say that. At the same time, when it comes to registration and mental health checks, it all seems to be men under the age of 25. And when it comes to gun control, I wonder if there's an avenue there to people often discuss registration in terms of guns and coming of age when you learn to drive a car when you're a teenager and so forth. And I wonder if there's can be the same sort of nuance and understanding that the easy access to these guns by young, troubled men, for the most part, is what brings us into these horror shows in our headline after headline. So I'm just thinking out loud about how I've seen things in the last year. My own perceptions have changed, but certainly I'm looking at each shooting differently, because I want more conclusive proof that it has to do with any sort of ethno-nationalism. Now, the El Paso one, obviously, that was the Walmart one, right? That's the one that
Yeah.
seems to be far and away the clearest. The synagogue, and down our way here in Southern California, where we both are, that obviously, when you had those manifestos, and that plays out in the QAnon documentary on HBO Max. I paid special attention to that, but in this iteration that we're still getting these troubled young men coming out, and it doesn't seem to matter which side of the political spectrum or which sites they gravitated towards.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't see these necessarily as mutually exclusive. I think I completely agree with your point on gender. This is a huge component. I mean, this is almost exclusively a male phenom. So, the issue of toxic masculinity obviously needs to be on the table as a major point of discussion in terms of what is it about the experience of masculinity, the culture of masculinity that encourages, a segment to see violence in the way that it's enacted. To see violence as heroic, to see violence as glamorous, or just to see violence as a way to kind of send a message, or just to exist as a way to kind of affirm your existence, as a way to not be anonymous, as a way to be somebody, so to speak. I think there's a lot of different factors that are involved in terms of any of these incidents of violence. They're usually not, I don't think, easily explained by one issue or one motivation or one factor. I think they're usually a combination of things going on. In some cases, there is a segment that where white supremacy is certainly very relevant to the discussion. I mean, you mentioned Dylan Roof. How could we talk about what happened there and not talk about white supremacy? So I don't
Well,
say that every time there's an act of mass casualty violence that's the case, but certainly some subsegment it is.
And I said that there were two incidents that were imprinted on my psyche, certainly Charlottesville, but I don't know if people realize this, but the Dylan Roof shootings and Trump's announcement into the Republican primary happened within a very short amount of time. I want to say 24 hours even. And I almost wonder if, I won't go further with that. I do want to, because I know you got to go, and I want to bring up one more thing, which is, when I was in Huntington Beach, and we corresponded a little before that. I told you I was going down there, and I found that the crowd was operating at maybe a 10 to 20% accuracy rate as far as the people that they were going after, that they were calling Nazis and white supremacists. And here's a comment I want to bring up. Stephen Horn says, labeling normal people as white supremacists or Nazis weakens the social stigma around those labels and makes people more willing to listen to their propaganda. I think that there's an interesting aspect of this, which is back in 2017, after Charlottesville, you had the Daily Beast, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, all what we consider to be left-wing publications saying Antifa is problematic and actually helps the forces that they say that they're against by basically just calling everybody a white supremacist. We're going to attack normies. If we identify the system as white supremacist, therefore, if you vote for Trump, you are a white supremacist. Therefore, bam, we just punched a Nazi in the face. Well, what I witnessed is I saw normal people getting punched in the face in Sacramento, in San Francisco on October the 17th of this last year. And the question is, if we don't make specific distinctions and we talk in broad theoretical terms, do we run the risk of fueling would-be Nazis and white supremacists because they see a certain amount of intolerance coming from the mob, and specifically from the mob that has been so prone or motivated by a kind of social justice to rectify the issues of the past and dismantle the system of white supremacy?
Well, let me be clear. I am not advocating for any kind of punch a Nazi approach here.
Sure.
So let's just get that on the
No,
table.
I do know that. I do know that.
I mean, we should have started with that.
But I guess what I'm saying
But
is
let's
that,
go to
yeah,
the Trump issue that you raised, because that's where it gets trickier. It's not a theoretical issue to refer to Donald Trump as a white supremacist. That is a characterization that's just simply borne out in facts, time and time again, based on not just his time as president, but his life prior to being president. And again, it maybe if your definition is you have to wear a Klan hood, although there's some evidence that his father did that. But if that's your definition, that it has to be that narrow, then yeah, he's not a white supremacist. But is he somebody who has expressed high degrees of racial animus consistently, time and time again during his presidency and prior to becoming president? Yeah, there is a lot of evidence about that. So it's not a theoretical issue. Now, what does it mean to support somebody who that evidence is pretty clear about? Does that mean your support of that person by definition makes you a white supremacist? I think that's a harder question to answer, but it certainly suggests you have some comfort level with that. If you're saying that, well, I don't like those things about Trump, but I'm going to vote for him anyways. I don't know what would it have taken for you to say I can't support him because of those things?
well,
What
it depends also how deeply researched people are. For example, what I brought up was Trump's of the Central Park. I'm forgetting the number now. My brain is it was
Yeah,
Central
five.
Park 5? It was
Yeah,
5. Okay. All right. I was getting all my numbers jumbled
yeah,
for a
no,
second there, but yeah, the Central Park 5, that he takes out a ad and that he is essentially wrong. That's enough to disqualify anybody in my mind. That there's also a racial element to it. Um,
absolutely.
is very dubious. Now, there may be I'm willing to bet that there's millions of Trump voters who don't even know about that. And that speaks to a larger issue of how educated people are, that essentially a reality star can walk in and just sort of swing his, influence, let's call it, and basically, you know, uh, become the phenomenon that he was. But I don't know that it's necessarily all. I guess if there's been one thread of this conversation, it's been more, sort of show me the evidence, more show me the evidence, because I've tried to make these arguments myself and I have failed. So if you can make them better than I can, then uh, I welcome it. And
Yeah. I
I
think you're right about the situation with the Central Park incident. That there probably were a lot of Trump voters, supporters who had no idea that that happened. Probably not aware of that. I'm not sure, had they been though, would that have changed? That's hard to say. What we do know about Trump voters though is racial resentment. Again, as I mentioned earlier, is a very strong predictor. And so, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us something about people who vote for Trump. That racial resentment
it
it tends
it
to be
well, it tells
exist
it.
at higher levels for folks that gravitate towards Trump. They tend to have higher levels of racial resentment than other folks who didn't vote for Trump on average. I mean, again, this gets all very individualistic, you can say, but we're talking about averages across, samples of people who voted for Trump.
And what study is that, or what quotient are we talking about?
Yeah, we're talking about multiple studies that have found this. Um, we can, I'm happy to provide you links to those, after the show.
Okay. Well, and I'm sure we're going to talk again. I would like that. We've been talking for months, and I'm glad we got a chance to just go live and just have like a
Yeah,
conversation out in which, and I still have questions. I'm not closed-minded to anything, certainly. I guess what it comes down to is when you talk, that I have seen so much on the streets, this, systemic white supremacy has been the focus, and it's been used to justify a lot of actions. And I'm not quite certain that it's always been in good faith. My question is this: if you ever came to a conclusion that was contrary, or, because I was talking to you when I was looking for white supremacists, you even said to me, "Are you reading in a little too much here?" With when I was looking at every single,
I
um,
did. Yeah.
and you challenged me. Now, some people might look at me and said that I've flipped somehow politically. I don't think I have. I've just witnessed a lot of bad behavior all year long, and it's certainly uh, made me ask, well, where are we going with all this? If I came to the conclusion that said we have to look at, at hate holistically, or otherwise it builds, it continues to snowball. If you go back to the late 80s, these neo-Nazi groups and anti-racist skinheads were going back and forth against each other to the days of the ARA, the Baldies of Minneapolis. I've talked about that a lot. If we're going to if we're going to allow somewhat these street wars to perpetuate, as we saw in DC. I see that's why the lens of the Capitol looks different to me, is because I saw every single fight leading up to it and I was there. And so as I ask myself, would the Capitol have even happened had there not been Antifa unrest? I talked to a national socialist, a confessed national socialist sympathizer, who said he studied hours of Antifa, tape. They call this guy hashtag Mr. Extra Creepy. I didn't even know he had a hashtag until this last week, but he's a guy who showed up on the 7th. The day after, to the scene of the crime, and he was there giving interviews, and I went live with him, and he admitted to being a National Socialist sympathizer, saying that it's always been the National Socialists against the communists, and I saw the gang wars of the late 80s between the anarcho punks and the neo Nazis expressed in that kind of broader sort of political vision, and it was scary, to be quite honest. And one hopes that it doesn't it doesn't catch on. If you came to a conclusion that these two sides fuel each other and make each other more relevant, is that a conclusion? If not you, but if is anybody else saying that? I guess
Oh,
somebody
yeah, a
else.
lot of people are saying that.
Yeah.
They talk about it in terms of a radicalization cycle. That there's a back and forth in terms of radicalization when you have political opponents essentially facing off in confrontations, both on and offline. That this is essentially kind of spurring this cycle of radicalization that just continues to heighten across the populace. So yeah, I think that is not at all a controversial idea, at least not in circles that I work in terms of scholarship on this issue. And I think most of the government officials that I talk to see that as well and talk in those terms.
This is an interesting last comment that I'll put here. My worry is that as this goes on longer and longer, the reasonable centrists will be forced to step into less and less reasonable measures to push back. And otherwise, does the polarization and constant radicalization and exacerbation, because now we have, media outlets that go after each other, and essentially everywhere I look, the media is reporting on Tucker Carlson or what he said this or that person said that.
Well, he
Does
is espousing replacement theory as of late, so it seems like a pretty notable thing to report on.
I have not watched it. I have seen the headlines though, and I see
Yeah,
them.
I watched it and played it for one of my classes because I thought it was so
Okay.
important.
Okay, and just to fill us in, what is replacement theory? And
Well, replacement theory is a book written by white supremacists, but it's basically the idea that whites are being replaced demographically, culturally, biologically. The existence of whites will cease to exist. What they call white genocide. So it was the kind of mantra for the terrorist perpetrator in New Zealand. Talked about replacement, but it's a widely discussed concept that comes under different names. Replacement is a term that's been used a lot
and
recently.
does does Carlson specifically talk about that, or is this
No,
more
he does. He
dog
does
whistle
his
kind of
whole
stuff?
song and dance where he says, basically he's promoting the idea of replacement, but then disavowing it from white supremacists, and he even preemptively kind of addresses that issue and says, "My critics are going to call me a white supremacist and say replacement theory is connected to white supremacy. However, that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about." And then goes on to essentially espouse replacement theory, where he in his specific discussion, I guess it was about 2 weeks ago on his show, he essentially was outlining how replacement is happening in the United States by new immigrants, and that's essentially disenfranchising American citizens. Which does he say white specifically? No, he doesn't. But does he mean white? I think it's pretty clear from what he's talking about.
Interesting. I will look into it more. I'm curious. But by the way, I have specifically avoided a lot of cable news. I don't even have cable. So,
Yeah.
I'm since almost all of a lot of different cable outlets stole my material.
Mm.
I'm a little disenchanted from what I think cable news has added as far as here we are. We had an hour and a half conversation, and I think these are the kinds of conversations where we can really start to understand instead of guests that come on and lambaste each other and name call and label, and because that's the thing that I'm trying to go against is
Mm-hmm.
polarization and labeling, and I certainly welcome conversation like this and. Look forward to us talking again in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, Jeremy, and I also look forward to future conversations. So
Yeah.
take care
Thanks
of
so
yourself.
thanks so much. Our guest has been Dr. Peter Simi. This is the Unblocked podcast, Unblocked Live. Next week, I'm going to be talking to Shannon Lanier. He's a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who has challenged the how we look at the Jefferson Memorial. He's going to be on next Wednesday, so everybody come back. It'll be at 1 p.m. next Wednesday. This has been Unblocked Live. My guest, Dr. Peter Simi. Thank you again, and take care, y'all.